Roman gladiator schools, factories of death and despair. The crowds roar, the sand drinks blood, the emperor's thumb decides who lives and who dies. This is the image we have of Roman gladiators, warriors of glory, fighting for honor in the magnificent Colosseum. But tonight, we'll venture beyond the arena's walls into the true heart of darkness where gladiators were forged. We'll enter the gladiator schools, the ludus, where human beings were systematically broken, rebuilt, and prepared for slaughter. What you're about to hear is not the romanticized tale of Hollywood films. This is the real story of how the Roman Empire turned human suffering into entertainment, and how the gladiator schools became factories of death, despair, and dehumanization that would make modern concentration camps seem almost merciful in comparison. The gladiator schools of ancient Rome were not schools in any sense we would recognize today. They were prisons, torture chambers, and slaughterhouses rolled into one horrific institution. For over 6 centuries, from the Roman Republic through the fall of the Western Empire, these places consumed human lives like furnaces consume coal. What emerged from their gates were not men, but broken creatures programmed to kill or die for the entertainment of crowds who had forgotten that the figures in the arena were human beings just like themselves. The architecture of human destruction. Picture, if you will, a compound surrounded by high walls topped with iron spikes. The year is 73 before the Common Era, and we stand before the gates of the gladiator school in Capua, the most infamous ludus in the Roman world. The very air here reeks of sweat, fear, and dried blood. This massive complex housed over 200 gladiators at any given time, and its design revealed the true nature of its purpose. The gladiator school was built like a fortress turned inward. The outer walls, 20 feet high and 3 feet thick, were designed not to keep enemies out, but to keep prisoners in. Guard towers positioned every 50 feet ensured that no corner of the compound escaped surveillance. The single gate was flanked by statues of Mars, the god of war, but these were no ordinary statues. They were carved from black marble and depicted the god feeding human hearts to ravens, a daily reminder to all who entered of their likely fate. Beyond the gate lay a courtyard surrounded by 3-story buildings. The ground floor housed the training areas, armories, and punishment cells. The second floor contained the living quarters for guards and trainers. The third floor was reserved for the school's owner and his guests, who could watch training sessions from covered galleries while dining on delicacies prepared by slave cooks. But it was underground where the true horror began. Beneath the main complex lay a maze of tunnels and chambers that stretched deep into the earth. Here were the holding cells where new arrivals were kept in isolation, the torture chambers where disobedient gladiators were punished, and the burial vaults where the bodies of those who died in training were stacked like cordwood. The training courtyard itself was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. It was built in the exact dimensions of the Colosseum's arena, so gladiators would become accustomed to the space where they would likely die. The sand was mixed with dried blood to give it the proper color and texture. Around the perimeter stood wooden posts topped with human skulls, the remains of gladiators who had tried to escape. Every aspect of the school's design was calculated to break the human spirit. The cells were deliberately too small for a man to stand upright in, forcing gladiators to spend their nights in cramped, painful positions. The corridors were maze-like, disorienting prisoners and making escape attempts nearly impossible. Even the placement of windows was strategic, positioned too high to see out of. They let in just enough light to remind the gladiators of the world they had lost. The school's owner, Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Batiatus, lived in luxury above this underground hell. His quarters featured marble floors, silk tapestries, and a dining room that could seat 50 guests. From his balcony, he could look down into the training yard and watch his property perform for his amusement. He kept detailed records of each gladiator's value, fighting style, and expected lifespan, treating them with no more consideration than a farmer might give to livestock. The business of human misery. The gladiator schools weren't just training centers. They were sophisticated business enterprises that generated enormous profits from human suffering. The economics of the gladiator trade revealed the true depths of Roman moral bankruptcy, where human lives were reduced to nothing more than entries in accounting ledgers. A gladiator school represented a massive capital investment. The initial cost of establishing a ludus could exceed 5 million denarii, equivalent to the annual tax revenue of a small province. This included purchasing the land, constructing the facilities, acquiring the initial stock of slaves, and hiring the necessary staff of trainers, guards, and medical personnel. But the returns were staggering. A successful gladiator could be rented out for a single fight for up to 50,000 denarii. The most famous gladiators commanded fees that exceeded the annual salaries of provincial governors. When Emperor Tiberius organized games for his son's funeral, he paid the gladiator school of Marcus Crassus 8 million denarii for a single day's entertainment. The schools operated on a carefully calculated business model that maximized profit while minimizing investment in individual gladiators. New slaves cost between 1,000 and 3,000 denarii, depending on their age, health, and background. Military prisoners were preferred because they already had some fighting experience, but criminals and debtors could be acquired more cheaply. The transformation of a slave into a gladiator required an investment of approximately 10,000 denarii per individual. This covered their training, equipment, food, and medical care during the 6-month to 2-year training period. However, the schools had developed methods to recoup this investment quickly through a practice known as provisional fighting. Gladiators in training were rented out for minor festivals and private games before they were fully trained. These events, held in smaller arenas throughout the empire, served as both practice for the gladiators and income for the schools. The mortality rate in these preliminary fights was enormous. Approximately 60% of gladiators died before completing their training. But the schools had calculated this into their business model. The most successful gladiator schools diversified their revenue streams. They offered training services to wealthy Romans who wanted to learn swordplay as a hobby. They bred and sold exotic animals for use in the beast hunts that preceded gladiator fights. They manufactured and sold weapons and armor to other schools and private individuals. Some schools even operated their own brothels, staffed by gladiators who were too injured to fight, but could still generate income through prostitution. The accounting records of the Capua school, preserved in the Vatican archives, reveal the cold calculation behind the gladiator trade. Gladiators were classified into categories based on their fighting ability and life expectancy. Prime fighters were expected to survive 12 to 15 fights before death or retirement. Standard fighters were given 6 to 8 fights. Fodder fighters, usually older slaves or those who showed little aptitude, were expected to die within their first 3 fights. The schools maintained detailed actuarial tables that predicted profit margins for each category of gladiator. A prime fighter who cost 15,000 denarii to train could generate revenues of 300,000 denarii over his career. Even fodder fighters, who might only survive 1 or 2 fights, could produce profits of 500% on the initial investment. Perhaps most chilling was the practice of death insurance. Gladiator schools purchased policies from Roman financiers that paid out when gladiators died in the arena. This created a perverse incentive structure where schools actually profited more from dead gladiators than living ones. Contracts have been discovered that show schools deliberately scheduling their least profitable gladiators against overwhelmingly superior opponents to trigger insurance payouts. The wealth generated by the gladiator schools was so enormous that it began to influence Roman politics. School owners became major political donors, purchasing influence with senators and governors. They funded public works projects and military campaigns in exchange for favorable legislation and exclusive contracts to provide entertainment for state occasions. The Emperor Domitian, who ruled from 81 to 96 Common Era, was so dependent on gladiator school revenues that he issued edicts requiring every major city in the empire to host mandatory gladiator games at least twice per year. This created a captive market that guaranteed profits for the school owners, while ensuring a steady supply of entertainment for the increasingly bloodthirsty Roman populace. The machinery of dehumanization. The moment a human being crossed the threshold of a gladiator school, a carefully orchestrated process of dehumanization began. This wasn't random cruelty. It was a systematic method developed over generations to transform ordinary people into killing machines who would perform for crowds and die on command. The process began with what the Romans called death of the former self. New arrivals were immediately stripped of all possessions, including their clothes. Their heads were shaved completely bald, and their bodies were scrubbed with harsh lye soap that burned the skin and removed any scent that might remind them of their former lives. They were then branded with hot irons, marking them permanently as property. But the physical marking was only the beginning. New gladiators were assigned numbers instead of names and were forbidden to speak of their past lives. Any mention of family, home, or previous occupation was punished with beatings. They were told that their families were dead to them and that they were dead to the world. To reinforce this message, they were forced to participate in mock funeral ceremonies for their former selves. The Romans understood that breaking a person's identity required destroying their sense of individual agency. New gladiators were given no choices about anything: when they ate, when they slept, when they trained, even when they could relieve themselves. Every aspect of their existence was controlled by others. This learned helplessness was essential to creating compliant killers who would follow orders without question. Sleep deprivation was used as a weapon of psychological warfare. Gladiators were deliberately kept awake for days at a time. then forced to make important decisions while their judgment was impaired by exhaustion. Those who made wrong choices were punished, creating a cycle of guilt and self-doubt that further eroded their sense of self-worth. The schools employed specialists known as mind breakers, psychological torturers who had studied the human psyche and knew exactly how to destroy it. These men, usually former gladiators who had survived long enough to earn the right to torment others, developed techniques that were remarkably sophisticated for their time. One common method was forced participation in the degradation of fellow prisoners. New gladiators were made to deliver beatings to other newcomers, creating guilt and complicity that bound them to their captors. They were forced to report on each other's behavior, destroying trust and preventing the formation of bonds that might lead to resistance. The gladiator schools also pioneered the use of intermittent reinforcement to create psychological dependence. Gladiators never knew when they might receive a small kindness, better food, a clean bandage, a night without beatings. This random mercy created a desperate hope that kept them emotionally attached to their captors even as they were being systematically destroyed. Religious indoctrination played a crucial role in the dehumanization process. Gladiators were taught that they were serving the gods through their fighting and dying. They were told that death in the arena was a sacred act that would guarantee them a place in the afterlife. This spiritual dimension made their suffering seem meaningful and reduced resistance to their fate. The most insidious aspect of the psychological conditioning was the gradual replacement of human empathy with a predatory mindset. Gladiators were taught to view other human beings as either threats to be eliminated or resources to be exploited. They were encouraged to develop friendships with fellow gladiators, only to be forced to fight those same friends to the death during training exercises. By the time a gladiator completed his training, he had been so thoroughly conditioned that he could no longer function as a normal human being. Former gladiators who were freed or escaped often couldn't integrate into regular society. They had been programmed to respond to human interaction only in the context of dominance and submission, making normal relationships impossible. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing in the early 2nd century Common Era, interviewed several former gladiators and documented their psychological state. He described men who could only sleep when chained, who became violently agitated in peaceful environments, and who had lost the ability to experience emotions other than rage and fear. They are no longer men, he wrote, but weapons in human form, forged in the fires of systematic cruelty. The daily nightmare of training. The training regimen in a gladiator school was designed not just to create fighters, but to systematically destroy any remaining traces of humanity in the trainees. Each day began before dawn with a ritual that served both practical and psychological purposes: the ceremony of the chains. Every gladiator was shackled hand and foot with iron manacles, connected by chains heavy enough to make normal movement difficult. These weren't removed during training, but were incorporated into the exercises themselves. Gladiators learned to fight while weighted down with iron, making them faster and more agile when the chains were finally removed for actual combat. But the chains served a more sinister purpose than mere physical conditioning. They were a constant reminder of the gladiators' status as slaves and property. The psychological impact of being permanently restrained was profound. It created a state of learned helplessness that made resistance seem futile. Even when gladiators were eventually allowed to fight without chains, most never attempted to flee because they had been conditioned to believe escape was impossible. The training itself followed a carefully structured progression designed to gradually desensitize gladiators to violence and death. New recruits began by practicing sword techniques on straw dummies, but these dummies were made from materials that would prepare them for the reality of cutting human flesh. The straw was mixed with animal blood and organs to simulate the resistance and texture of a living body. As training progressed, gladiators were forced to practice on live animals. They began with small creatures like rabbits and birds, progressing to pigs, goats, and eventually horses. This served multiple purposes. It taught them anatomy and vital points while gradually accustoming them to the act of killing. Those who showed reluctance or squeamishness were beaten until they complied. The Roman writer Seneca, who observed gladiator training during his time as an advisor to Emperor Nero, documented the progression in horrific detail. He described how new gladiators would initially vomit or faint when forced to kill animals, but how they were systematically conditioned through repetition and punishment until they could slaughter without emotion. Combat training between human opponents began with wooden weapons and padded armor, but even these practice sessions were designed to inflict real pain and injury. Gladiators were encouraged to fight with genuine hatred, and those who held back were punished. Training partners were deliberately rotated to prevent the formation of friendships that might interfere with their willingness to kill. The doctrine, or head trainers, were themselves former gladiators who had survived long enough to earn positions of authority. These men understood intimately how to break the human spirit because they had experienced it themselves. They knew exactly which psychological pressure points would most effectively destroy a person's resistance. One of the most brutal aspects of training was the practice of punishment fights. Gladiators who disobeyed orders, showed insufficient aggression, or committed minor infractions were forced to fight each other with real weapons as punishment. These weren't training exercises. They were deliberately scheduled to result in serious injury or death, as an example to other trainees. The schools maintained detailed records of each gladiator's psychological profile and fighting style. Trainers would deliberately match gladiators against opponents who would exploit their specific fears or weaknesses. A gladiator who showed concern for injured opponents might be forced to fight someone who was already wounded. One who displayed claustrophobia might be made to fight in an enclosed space. Medical care during training was deliberately minimal and often used as another form of psychological torture. Injured gladiators were treated just enough to keep them alive and functional, but wounds were often left to heal naturally to create intimidating scars. Some injuries were even deliberately worsened to create more dramatic visual effects for future fights. The Romans had discovered that physical pain was less effective at breaking human resistance than psychological torment. They developed techniques that would be recognizable to modern experts in psychological warfare. Gladiators were subjected to unpredictable schedules, contradictory orders, and constant uncertainty about their fate. Perhaps most devastating was the practice of friendship punishment. When gladiators formed emotional bonds with fellow trainees, the instructors would deliberately force them to fight each other. Winners were rewarded, while losers were often killed, creating guilt and trauma that further isolated the survivors and made them afraid to form human connections. The training culminated in what was called the Trial of Worthiness, a series of fights against increasingly skilled opponents that determined a gladiator's ranking and fighting specialty. These trials had mortality rates approaching 50%, but they were considered essential to weed out those who lacked the proper conditioning for arena combat. Those who survived the training process were no longer recognizable as the people they had once been. They had been systematically stripped of empathy, moral restraint, and individual identity. They had been rebuilt as instruments of violence who could kill on command and die with apparent acceptance. The gladiator schools had perfected a process of human engineering that transformed men into monsters, and they did it with scientific precision. The sexual nightmare. What history books rarely discuss in detail is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of gladiator schools: the systematic sexual abuse that was considered not just normal, but essential to the training process. This wasn't random violence or the result of individual depravity. It was institutional policy designed to complete the dehumanization of the gladiators and demonstrate the absolute power their owners held over every aspect of their existence. Gladiators were viewed as sexual objects as much as fighting machines. Their muscular bodies, scars, and proximity to death made them objects of perverse fascination for wealthy Romans of both sexes. The schools capitalized on this by operating what were essentially brothels alongside their training facilities. Wealthy Roman women, particularly those married to older or absent husbands, paid enormous sums to spend nights with gladiators. These weren't romantic encounters. They were transactions where human beings were rented out like furniture. The women often specifically requested gladiators who bore fresh wounds or were scheduled to fight soon, finding excitement in the proximity to violence and death. The poet Juvenal, writing in the early 2nd century Common Era, described the obsession of upper-class Roman women with gladiators in terms that reveal the depths of their depravity. He wrote of women who collected gladiator sweat in small vials to use as perfume, who paid enormous sums to watch gladiators train while naked, and who competed with each other to acquire the most dangerous and scarred fighters as lovers. But it wasn't just paying customers who sexually abused the gladiators. The trainers, guards, and school administrators regularly raped both male and female gladiators as a method of establishing dominance and control. This wasn't seen as criminal behavior. Roman law explicitly gave owners the right to use their slaves for all purposes, which was understood to include sexual use. The rape of male gladiators was particularly systematic because it served the dual purpose of sexual gratification for the perpetrators and psychological destruction of the victims. In Roman culture, being sexually penetrated was seen as the ultimate humiliation for a man. It marked him as feminine and weak. Gladiators who were regularly raped often became psychologically broken, which made them easier to control while paradoxically making them more vicious fighters. Female gladiators faced an even more horrific existence. Known as gladiatrices, these women were subjected to all the same brutal training as their male counterparts, while also being available for sexual use by anyone with authority over them. They were often forced to fight naked or nearly naked, not for any practical reason, but purely for the sexual gratification of spectators. The breeding of gladiators was another aspect of the sexual exploitation. Female gladiators and female slaves in the schools were systematically impregnated by male gladiators to produce children who would be raised from birth to fight in the arena. These breeding programs were managed with the same attention to detail that Romans applied to horse breeding, with careful records kept of bloodlines and genetic traits. Pregnant female gladiators were forced to continue training and even fighting until late in their pregnancies. Some were made to give birth in the arena itself as a form of entertainment. The children were immediately separated from their mothers and raised by the school as future gladiators, ensuring a steady supply of fighters who knew no other life. The psychological impact of this systematic sexual abuse was profound and intentional. It completed the process of dehumanization by removing the last vestiges of personal dignity and bodily autonomy. Gladiators learned that they had no rights over their own bodies, that they existed solely for the pleasure and profit of others. Some gladiators developed what modern psychologists would recognize as Stockholm Syndrome, becoming emotionally attached to their abusers as a survival mechanism. Others retreated into complete emotional numbness, shutting down their capacity for feeling to protect themselves from the constant trauma. The Roman physician Galen, who served as a doctor in several gladiator schools, documented the physical and psychological effects of the sexual abuse in clinical detail. He described gladiators who had lost the ability to form normal relationships, who could only function sexually in contexts of violence and domination, and who often inflicted the same abuse on newer gladiators as a way of asserting the only form of power available to them. The sexual exploitation wasn't limited to individual acts, but was woven into the very fabric of gladiator culture. Gladiators were taught songs and chants that celebrated their sexual availability. They were given nicknames that referenced their sexual experiences or physical attributes. They were trained to pose and move in ways that emphasized their body's sexual appeal to potential customers. Perhaps most disturbing was the complete normalization of this abuse within Roman society. Wealthy Romans discussed the sexual qualities of gladiators as casually as they might discuss the merits of different wines. They kept detailed records of their favorite gladiators' sexual performance and shared recommendations with friends. The humanity of the gladiators was so completely denied that their sexual abuse was treated as entertainment in itself. The contracts between gladiator schools and their wealthy clients, several of which have been preserved in legal archives, explicitly detail the sexual services available and their pricing. These documents, written in matter-of-fact legal language, provide chilling evidence of how thoroughly the Romans had reduced human beings to commodities to be bought, sold, and used without regard for their suffering or dignity. The women warriors, gladiatrices. The existence of female gladiators represents perhaps the most twisted chapter in an already horrific system. These women, known as gladiatrices, weren't just fighters. They were symbols of the complete moral collapse of Roman society, where even the traditional roles of women as mothers and wives could be perverted into violent entertainment. Female gladiators came from various sources. each representing a different level of societal breakdown. Some were convicted criminals, sentenced to the arena as an alternative to execution. Others were slaves sold by their families to pay debts or acquired through conquest. Most shocking of all, some were volunteers, women from respectable families who had fallen on hard times and saw the arena as their only chance for survival and potential freedom. The training of female gladiators was deliberately designed to strip away every aspect of traditional femininity. Their heads were shaved completely bald, their bodies were scarred with brands and training wounds, and they were forced to develop the muscular physiques that Roman society considered masculine and therefore repulsive in women. This wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate process of dehumanization that made it easier for crowds to watch them die. Female gladiators were typically smaller and weaker than their male counterparts, so they were usually matched against each other or against wild animals rather than male fighters. However, this didn't make their fights less brutal. If anything, the crowds found female combat more exciting precisely because it violated every social norm about women's proper role in society. The most popular type of female gladiator combat was the Amazon hunt, where scantily clad women were forced to fight against exotic beasts imported from Africa and Asia. These weren't fair fights. The women were deliberately given inferior weapons and minimal armor to increase the likelihood of spectacular deaths. The crowds cheered loudest when the women were torn apart by lions or trampled by elephants. Some female gladiators were forced to reenact mythological scenes where women met violent deaths. They might be required to play Dido burning herself on a pyre, or Medea killing her children, or the Amazons being defeated by Greek heroes. These theatrical executions combined narrative entertainment with genuine human slaughter, creating a form of performance art built around real suffering and death. The most disturbing records concerning female gladiators come from the reign of Emperor Domitian, who was particularly fond of women's combat. He organized special games where pregnant female gladiators were forced to fight until they gave birth in the arena. The newborn children were immediately killed with spears or fed to wild animals, while the mothers were expected to continue fighting. Contemporary accounts describe crowds that went wild with excitement at these spectacles. Female gladiators were also used in a particularly cruel form of entertainment called rape battles, where they were forced to fight while being sexually assaulted by male performers dressed as gods or mythological figures. These events combined graphic violence with explicit sexual content, creating a form of pornographic bloodsport that appealed to the most depraved elements of Roman society. The living conditions for female gladiators were even worse than those endured by their male counterparts. They were routinely raped by guards, trainers, and paying customers. They were forced to serve as prostitutes when not training or fighting. Many were deliberately kept pregnant to provide a steady supply of children for future gladiator programs. Female gladiators who showed exceptional skill or courage were sometimes granted small privileges, but these often came with additional burdens. A successful gladiatrix might be given better food or living quarters, but she would also be expected to train newer female fighters, forcing her to participate in the systematic abuse of other women. The psychological toll on female gladiators was enormous. Many developed what modern experts would recognize as severe dissociative disorders, mentally separating themselves from their bodies during training and combat. Others became hyperaggressive, channeling their trauma into violent rage that made them more effective fighters, but destroyed their capacity for normal human relationships. Archaeological evidence from gladiator cemeteries has provided disturbing insights into the lives of female gladiators. Skeletal remains show evidence of extensive trauma from training and combat, but also signs of repeated pregnancies and gynecological injuries consistent with systematic sexual abuse. Many female gladiator skeletons show evidence of death in childbirth, suggesting they were forced to fight even while pregnant. One particularly haunting discovery came from a gladiator cemetery in London, where archaeologists found the remains of a young woman who had clearly been a gladiatrix. Her skeleton showed evidence of extensive combat training and multiple healed fractures, but she had died in childbirth at approximately age 16. Chemical analysis of her bones revealed she had been fed a diet supplemented with human blood, a practice used to make gladiators more aggressive and brutal. The Roman writer Tacitus described attending games where female gladiators fought against male criminals in mock executions designed to look like mythological scenes. He wrote with disgust about crowds that cheered as women were raped and murdered simultaneously, calling it entertainment that would make demons weep. Yet even his revulsion didn't prevent him from attending multiple such events, illustrating how completely normalized this brutality had become. Perhaps most tragic was the fate of children born to female gladiators. These infants were considered property of the gladiator schools from birth and were raised specifically to die for entertainment. They knew no other world, no other purpose. They were so thoroughly conditioned that they often asked to fight rather than being forced to do so. Having been trained from infancy to see death in combat as the highest honor they could achieve. The children of the arena. No aspect of the gladiator schools is more disturbing than what happened to the children born within their walls. These weren't just any children. They were the offspring of systematic rape, born to mothers who were themselves prisoners, and they were raised from birth with the sole purpose of dying for the entertainment of others. Children born in gladiator schools were considered property from the moment they drew breath. They were tattooed with their owner's mark while still infants and began a form of training as soon as they could walk. By age 3, they were killing small animals with their bare hands. By age 5, they were fighting each other with real weapons. By age 10, most had committed multiple murders and witnessed countless deaths. The Romans had a specific term for these children, arena-born. They were considered a special delicacy for crowds because their entire lives had been spent preparing for death. They knew no other world, no other purpose, no other identity beyond their role as killers. They had been so thoroughly conditioned that they often begged to fight rather than being forced to do so. The training of arena-born children was even more systematic and brutal than that inflicted on adult slaves. Because their minds were more malleable, the psychological conditioning could be more complete. They were taught from infancy that killing was natural, that death was glorious, and that their only value lay in their ability to entertain crowds with their suffering. Arena-born children were separated from their mothers immediately after weaning to prevent the formation of emotional bonds that might interfere with their conditioning. They were raised in groups by specially trained handlers who had been selected for their ability to remain emotionally detached from the children in their care. These handlers, usually former gladiators who had been castrated to prevent them from fathering their own children, became the only parental figures the arena-born would ever know. The educational curriculum for arena-born children focused exclusively on combat skills and death preparation. They learned no reading or writing, no mathematics, no history beyond the stories of famous gladiators who had died gloriously in the arena. Their entire intellectual development was channeled toward becoming more effective killers. Physical training began before the children could properly walk. Infants were subjected to exercises designed to increase their pain tolerance and reduce their sensitivity to violence. They were exposed to loud noises, bright lights, and sudden movements to condition them for the sensory chaos of arena combat. They were deliberately frightened, and then comforted only when they showed aggressive responses rather than fear. By age 4, arena-born children were practicing with real weapons scaled down to their size. They learned sword techniques, spear throwing, and net fighting using equipment that could actually kill. Training accidents were common and were treated as learning experiences rather than tragedies. Children who were seriously injured during training were often killed rather than treated, with their deaths used to teach other children about the consequences of weakness. The social dynamics among arena-born children were deliberately manipulated to prevent the formation of supportive relationships. They were encouraged to compete with each other for food, attention, and basic necessities. They were taught to view their fellow children as either resources to be exploited or threats to be eliminated. Friendship was discouraged through punishment, while betrayal and aggression were rewarded. One of the most horrific practices was the graduation ceremony, held when arena-born children reached adolescence. This involved a series of increasingly difficult fights against other children, with the understanding that only a fraction would survive to adulthood. These weren't training exercises. They were genuine battles to the death, designed to weed out the weak and traumatize the survivors into complete emotional numbness. Archaeological evidence from gladiator cemeteries reveals the true horror of what happened to these children. Skeletal remains show that most arena-born children never lived to see their 15th birthday. Their bones bear evidence of intensive training from early childhood, but also show signs of deliberate malnutrition designed to keep them weak and compliant while still maintaining their fighting ability. The most chilling discovery came from the Gladiator cemetery in Ephesus, where archaeologists found a mass grave containing the remains of 47 children, all between the ages of 8 and 14. All had died violent deaths, but the arrangement of their bones suggested they had been forced to kill each other in some massive final spectacle. Carbon dating revealed they had all died on the same day, possibly as part of a special exhibition celebrating a major Roman victory. Chemical analysis of arena-born children's bones has revealed evidence of systematic drugging throughout their lives. They were given substances that increased aggression while reducing empathy and fear responses. Some were treated with compounds that accelerated physical development while stunting emotional growth, creating child-sized killing machines with the strength of adults, but none of the moral restraints that might prevent them from committing atrocities. The The psychological conditioning of arena-born children was so complete that those few who survived to adulthood were essentially inhuman. Former gladiators who had been arena-born were described by contemporary writers as beings who could only relate to other people through violence. They had no understanding of concepts like mercy, love, or compassion. They viewed all human interaction through the lens of dominance and submission. Perhaps most tragic was what happened to arena-born children who showed exceptional promise as fighters. These children were sometimes adopted by wealthy Romans as novelty pets, living in luxury while being displayed at dinner parties as conversation pieces. However, they remained psychologically damaged and dangerous. Several historical accounts describe arena-born children who murdered their adoptive families, apparently unable to understand that violence wasn't an appropriate response to every situation. The Roman historian Suetonius interviewed several arena-born gladiators who had managed to survive to adulthood and earn their freedom. He described men who could only sleep when surrounded by weapons, who became violently agitated in peaceful environments, and who had never experienced emotions like joy or sadness. "They are not men," he wrote, "but walking corpses animated by rage and trained to kill. They represent the ultimate triumph of our civilization's capacity to corrupt innocence itself." The medical horrors. The gladiator schools employed physicians whose job was not to heal, but to keep gladiators alive just long enough to die publicly in the most entertaining manner possible. These medical professionals pioneered techniques of pain management and life preservation that were designed not to eliminate suffering, but to control and extend it for maximum theatrical effect. The physicians who worked in gladiator schools, known as Medici gladiators, occupied a unique position in Roman society. They were often highly trained doctors who had fallen from grace due to gambling debts, political conflicts, or criminal behavior. Others were talented slaves who had been purchased specifically for their medical knowledge. All of them had abandoned the Hippocratic oath in favor of a more profitable but morally bankrupt form of practice. Gladiators were often forced to fight while injured or seriously ill. The doctors would inject them with powerful stimulants derived from plants and animal extracts to mask pain and increase aggression. These cocktails, whose recipes were closely guarded trade secrets, could make a dying gladiator fight with superhuman strength for short periods before his body collapsed completely. Wounds were deliberately left untreated if the resulting scars would make a gladiator more visually appealing to crowds. Doctors would guide the healing process to create dramatic-looking injuries that appeared worse than they actually were. Or conversely, they would conceal serious internal damage so that a gladiator might collapse unexpectedly during combat for dramatic effect. The Roman physician Galen, before he became famous as the personal doctor to emperors, spent several years working in gladiator schools. His private notes, discovered in a monastery library in the 12th century, reveal the horrific details of gladiator medicine. He described techniques for deliberately breaking and resetting bones in painful positions to create more dramatic fighting stances. He documented the use of drugs to increase pain sensitivity, making gladiators more responsive to crowd reactions and more likely to provide entertaining displays of agony. Perhaps most disturbing was the practice of death preparation. Gladiators who were expected to die in upcoming matches were given drugs that would make their deaths more spectacular. Some substances caused muscle spasms that would continue after death, creating the illusion that the gladiator was still fighting even as his life ebbed away. Others caused massive internal bleeding that would create dramatic fountains of blood when the gladiator was finally pierced by his opponent's weapon. The gladiator school physicians developed an extensive pharmacological knowledge based entirely on human experimentation. They tested various poisons, stimulants, and hallucinogens on gladiators to determine their effects on combat performance and death scenes. Gladiators who were no longer useful as fighters were used as test subjects for new drug combinations, with their reactions carefully documented for future use. Pain management in gladiator schools was not about reducing suffering, but about controlling it. Doctors learned to identify the exact level of pain that would make a gladiator fight most aggressively without incapacitating him completely. They developed techniques for inflicting precise amounts of pain at specific moments during combat to enhance the entertainment value of fights. Infections were deliberately cultivated if they created interesting visual effects. Doctors would introduce specific bacteria into wounds to create colorful pus or unusual swellings that crowds would find fascinating. They learned to control the progression of diseases so that gladiators would weaken gradually rather than dying suddenly, allowing for longer and more dramatic final fights. The medical instruments used in gladiator schools were specifically designed for torture rather than healing. Surgical tools were deliberately made rougher and more painful to use. Bandages were treated with irritating substances that would cause ongoing discomfort. Even basic medical procedures like setting broken bones were performed in ways that maximized pain while ensuring the gladiator would heal enough to fight again. One particularly horrific practice was the use of gladiators as living anatomy lessons. Medical students would pay to observe surgeries performed on conscious gladiators without any form of pain relief. These procedures, which served no therapeutic purpose, were conducted purely for educational entertainment. Students would bid on the opportunity to perform experimental surgeries on living gladiators, treating human beings as nothing more than practice subjects. The doctors kept detailed medical records that read like horror novels. They documented which types of wounds produced the most dramatic death scenes, which drugs created the most entertaining behavioral changes, and which surgical procedures could be performed on gladiators while keeping them conscious and fighting. These records were shared between schools and became the basis for increasingly sophisticated methods of medical torture. Female gladiators received particularly barbaric medical treatment. They were subjected to experimental gynecological procedures designed to increase their fertility while making childbirth more dangerous and painful. Doctors would perform cesarean sections on conscious women, removing babies that would then be killed in front of their mothers before the women were sewn up and sent back to training. The contraceptive methods used on female gladiators were intentionally harmful. Rather than preventing pregnancy, they were designed to cause repeated miscarriages that would weaken the women and create visible signs of suffering that crowds found entertaining. Some female gladiators were deliberately infected with diseases that would cause visible symptoms during fights, adding an element of disgust to the spectacle of their deaths. Perhaps most chilling was the practice of life extension torture. When popular gladiators were seriously injured, doctors would perform experimental procedures to keep them alive as long as possible while maximizing their suffering. They developed techniques for keeping people conscious and alert even while their bodies were failing, ensuring that the gladiators would remain aware of their agony until the final moment of death. The influence of gladiator school medicine extended far beyond the arena. The techniques developed for torturing gladiators were adopted by Roman military doctors for interrogating prisoners of war. They were used by civilian physicians who wanted to experiment on patients without legal consequences. They became part of the standard medical curriculum, teaching generations of Roman doctors that human suffering was a tool to be manipulated rather than alleviated. Modern medical historians who have studied the gladiator school documents describe them as representing one of the darkest chapters in the history of medicine. These doctors had perverted the healing arts into instruments of systematic torture, creating a medical system based entirely on prolonging and intensifying human suffering for the entertainment of others. The feast of human flesh. What even most historians rarely discuss in detail is the overwhelming evidence that gladiator schools practiced systematic cannibalism. This wasn't the result of starvation or desperation during famines. It was a deliberate policy designed to complete the dehumanization of the gladiators and destroy their last connections to normal human society. Roman documents from the gladiator school in Pompeii, preserved by volcanic ash and discovered by archaeologists in the 19th century, describe regular feast days when gladiators were forced to consume the flesh of their fallen comrades. These weren't random acts of savagery. They were carefully orchestrated rituals designed to break down the last vestiges of human connection and moral restraint among the prisoners. The process began with new gladiators being forced to eat human flesh as part of their initiation. Those who refused were subjected to increasingly severe tortures until they complied. The flesh was often prepared as elaborate delicacies, seasoned with expensive spices, and presented as gourmet meals to make the act seem like a privilege rather than a horror. The psychological message was clear. You are no longer human, and the sooner you accept this reality, the easier your existence will be. The cannibalistic rituals served multiple purposes beyond simple dehumanization. They created bonds of shared guilt and complicity among the gladiators, making it psychologically impossible for them to see themselves as victims. They destroyed any remaining religious or cultural taboos that might have provided internal resistance to the demands of their trainers. Most importantly, they eliminated the natural human revulsion toward killing that might have interfered with their performance in the arena. Archaeological evidence strongly supports these horrific historical accounts. Bones found in gladiator quarters show clear cut marks consistent with deliberate butchering for consumption. The cuts are precise and systematic, indicating that the dismemberment was performed by someone with anatomical knowledge rather than occurring randomly during combat. Chemical analysis of cooking vessels found in gladiator schools reveals traces of human proteins alongside animal remains, confirming that human flesh was regularly prepared and consumed. The human bones found in gladiator school kitchens show evidence of specific preparation techniques designed to make the flesh more palatable. Long bones were cracked to extract marrow, which was considered a delicacy. Skulls were opened to remove brains, which were often prepared as a paste mixed with wine and herbs. The systematic nature of these preparations indicates that cannibalism wasn't an occasional occurrence, but a regular part of gladiator school culture. Different schools developed their own cannibalistic traditions and recipes. The gladiator school in Capua was known for its warrior's feast, where the heart of a deceased gladiator was divided among his former training partners and consumed raw. The school in Pergamon specialized in preparing human flesh as elaborate stews that disguised the source of the meat. The school in Alexandria developed techniques for preserving human flesh as dried rations that could be eaten during long training sessions. The Romans had convinced themselves that consuming human flesh would transfer the strength and courage of the deceased to the living. Gladiators were taught that eating their fallen comrades was a form of honoring their memory and absorbing their fighting spirit. This pseudo-religious justification made the practice seem noble rather than horrific, allowing both participants and observers to rationalize behavior that violated every known taboo of civilized society. Training sessions often concluded with communal meals, where human flesh was served alongside regular food. New gladiators were initially given small amounts mixed with other ingredients, gradually increasing the proportion until they were consuming purely human meals. The trainers monitored the psychological effects of this diet, noting that gladiators who regularly consumed human flesh became more aggressive and lost their natural reluctance to kill. Female gladiators were subjected to particularly horrific cannibalistic rituals. They were forced to consume the flesh of their own children when infants born in the schools died during training or were killed for various infractions. Pregnant female gladiators were sometimes forced to consume specific parts of executed prisoners while still carrying their own children, in the belief that this would make their offspring more vicious fighters. The cannibalistic practices extended beyond simple consumption of flesh. Gladiators were forced to drink human blood mixed with wine during training sessions. They were made to eat human organs while they were still warm, often immediately after executions. Some schools practiced ritual cannibalism, where gladiators had to consume specific body parts of their opponents immediately after killing them in training fights. The psychological effects of systematic cannibalism were profound and intentional. Gladiators who regularly consumed human flesh reported losing their sense of individual identity and merging psychologically with the collective identity of the school. They developed an addiction to violence that went beyond mere conditioning. They began to crave combat and death as sources of both physical and psychological nourishment. Contemporary Roman writers who visited gladiator schools documented the cannibalistic practices with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. The historian Cassius Dio wrote about attending a banquet at a gladiator school where human flesh was served to guests as an exotic delicacy. He described the surreal experience of dining on perfectly prepared human steaks while watching gladiators train for upcoming matches. The influence of gladiator school cannibalism extended into Roman society more broadly. Wealthy Romans began hosting dinner parties where human flesh was served as the ultimate display of power and transgression. Physicians began prescribing human flesh as medicine for various ailments, believing it possessed supernatural healing properties. The normalization of cannibalism within gladiator schools helped break down one of humanity's most fundamental taboos throughout the empire. Modern anthropologists and psychologists who have studied historical accounts of systematic cannibalism describe it as one of the most effective methods ever developed for destroying human empathy and social bonding. The gladiator schools had discovered that forcing people to consume human flesh created psychological changes that went far beyond simple conditioning. It fundamentally altered their brain chemistry and capacity for normal human relationships. The spectacle of engineered madness. The psychological damage inflicted by gladiator schools often manifested in forms of madness that the Romans learned to exploit as yet another form of entertainment. Gladiators who had been driven insane by their training and experiences were not retired or treated. They were showcased in special madness fights, where their unpredictable behavior and genuine psychological breaks were presented as exotic spectacles for bloodthirsty crowds. These events were advertised throughout the empire as battles against demons or contests with the possessed. The reality was far more tragic and disturbing. Brain-damaged gladiators, often suffering from what modern medicine would recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, traumatic brain injuries, and drug-induced psychosis, were forced to fight while experiencing genuine psychological episodes. The Romans had identified several categories of gladiator madness, each of which produced different types of entertaining behavior. Blood-mad gladiators were those who had developed an uncontrollable compulsion to kill and would attack anything that moved, including spectators, other gladiators, and even inanimate objects. Death-seekers were gladiators who had become suicidal but retained enough fighting skill to create dramatic suicide-by-combat scenarios. Beastmen were gladiators who had regressed to animalistic behavior and would fight on all fours, biting and clawing rather than using weapons. The gladiator schools deliberately cultivated these forms of madness through systematic psychological abuse and experimental drug treatments. They discovered that certain combinations of trauma, isolation, and chemical manipulation could produce predictable forms of insanity that translated into compelling arena performances. Mad gladiators were often more popular with crowds than sane ones because their genuine terror and confusion created an authenticity that scripted fights couldn't match. One of the most popular forms of madness entertainment was the terror maze, where psychologically broken gladiators were released into elaborate underground chambers filled with traps, mirrors, and hidden attackers. The gladiators, often blinded or drugged to enhance their disorientation, would stumble through these mazes while crowds above watched through grated openings. The combination of genuine fear, psychological breakdown, and physical danger created a form of live-action horror that Roman audiences found irresistible. The school in Pompeii specialized in creating gladiators with specific phobias that could be exploited for entertainment. They would deliberately traumatize gladiators with particular fears: darkness, enclosed spaces, certain animals, and then force them to fight in environments designed to trigger these phobias. The resulting panic attacks and breakdowns were considered high-quality entertainment, with wealthy Romans betting on how long each gladiator could maintain his sanity before collapsing completely. Some gladiators developed a condition the Romans called arena madness, a dissociative state where they could only function during combat situations. Outside the arena, these men would become completely catatonic, staring blankly and refusing to eat or speak. However, the moment they entered combat, they would explode into berserker-like fury that made them incredibly dangerous opponents. Rather than treating this as the serious psychological injury it clearly was, the Romans celebrated it as the ultimate achievement of gladiator training. The physicians working in gladiator schools became experts in both creating and manipulating various forms of madness. They developed drug cocktails that could induce temporary psychosis, making sane gladiators appear mad for specific fights. They learned to identify the early signs of natural psychological breakdown and would accelerate the process through targeted abuse and isolation. They kept detailed records of which types of trauma produced which forms of entertaining madness. Female gladiators who developed madness were used in particularly cruel spectacles. They were often forced to fight while experiencing psychotic episodes where they believed they were defending their children from mythological monsters. The crowds would cheer as these women battled against imaginary threats, swinging weapons at empty air, while genuinely believing they were protecting their families from supernatural danger. The most disturbing aspect of the madness spectacles was how they were integrated into religious festivals and state ceremonies. Mad gladiators were presented as examples of divine punishment or supernatural possession, turning genuine mental illness into theological entertainment. Priests would exorcise gladiators in public ceremonies that were actually elaborate torture sessions designed to worsen their psychological conditions. Children were often brought to watch the madness fights as educational experiences. Roman parents believed that seeing the consequences of moral weakness and disobedience would help teach their children proper behavior. The sight of grown men reduced to gibbering madness was presented as a cautionary tale about what happened to those who failed to conform to societal expectations. The historian Suetonius recorded an incident where Emperor Caligula forced an entire gladiator school to consume hallucinogenic mushrooms before a major festival. The resulting spectacle, where dozens of gladiators fought invisible enemies and attacked spectators they perceived as monsters, was so popular that it became a regular feature at imperial games. The emperor would personally direct the drugging process, adjusting doses to create specific types of hallucinations and behavioral changes. Modern psychiatrists who have studied historical accounts of gladiator madness describe it as representing some of the most systematic psychological abuse ever documented. The Romans had essentially created human laboratories where they could experiment with different methods of driving people insane, then monetize the results by selling tickets to watch the breakdown of human consciousness. The techniques developed in gladiator schools for creating and exploiting madness were later adopted by other institutions throughout the empire. Military commanders used them to break enemy prisoners, Slave owners employed them to control rebellious slaves. Political leaders utilized them to eliminate opponents while providing entertaining public spectacles. The gladiator schools had perfected the art of turning human suffering into profit, and their methods spread throughout Roman society like a virus. The economics of death, financial records of human trading. The gladiator schools operated according to sophisticated business models that treated human lives as nothing more than inventory to be managed for maximum profit. Recently discovered accounting records from various schools throughout the empire reveal the cold mathematical precision with which the Romans calculated the value of human suffering and death. The initial investment required to establish a gladiator school was enormous. Land acquisition, construction costs, and initial slave purchases could exceed 10 million denarii, equivalent to the annual budget of a major provincial city. However, the potential returns were so substantial that wealthy investors competed fiercely for the opportunity to enter the gladiator trade. The school of Marcus Licinius Crassus, whose accounting records were discovered in a villa outside Rome, maintained detailed profit and loss statements that read like livestock trading documents. New slaves were categorized by age, health, fighting potential, and expected lifespan. Each gladiator was assigned a unique identification number and tracked through elaborate record-keeping systems that monitored their training progress, medical condition, and market value. A typical breakdown of gladiator values reveals the horrific economics of the trade. Untrained slaves suitable for gladiator training cost between 2,000 and 5,000 denarii, depending on their physical condition and background. Military prisoners commanded higher prices because of their existing combat experience, while criminals and debtors could be acquired more cheaply. The transformation process into a fighting gladiator required an additional investment of approximately 15,000 denarii per individual, covering training, equipment, medical care, and housing costs. However, a successfully trained gladiator could generate revenues of 50,000 to 100,000 denarii per fight, depending on their reputation and the prestige of the event. The most famous gladiators commanded fees that exceeded the annual salaries of provincial governors. When Emperor Trajan celebrated his victory over the Dacians, he paid the Capua school 12 million denarii for a single day's entertainment featuring their most skilled fighters. The schools maximized their returns through diversified revenue streams that exploited every aspect of their human property. Beyond fighting fees, they charged for training services, weapon and armor sales, stud services for breeding programs, and sexual access to their gladiators. Some schools operated their own betting syndicates, using inside knowledge of gladiator conditions and fight arrangements to guarantee profits from gambling activities. The most disturbing aspect of the financial records is the detailed actuarial calculations used to predict gladiator lifespans and optimize profit extraction. Gladiators were classified into risk categories based on their fighting style, age, and psychological condition. High-value, short-term gladiators were those expected to generate maximum revenue before dying quickly. Low-value, long-term gladiators were those who might survive many fights, but would never command premium fees. Insurance policies were a crucial component of the gladiator business model. schools purchased coverage from Roman financiers that paid out when gladiators died in the arena. These death benefits often exceeded the gladiator's market value, creating perverse incentives where schools actually profited more from dead fighters than living ones. Contracts have been discovered showing schools deliberately scheduling their least profitable gladiators against overwhelmingly superior opponents to trigger insurance payouts. The breeding programs operated by larger schools represented a particularly profitable long-term investment strategy. Female gladiators and female slaves were systematically impregnated to produce children who would be raised from birth as arena fighters. The accounting records show that arena-born gladiators cost approximately 60% less to train than adult converts, while commanding similar fees in the marketplace. Detailed cost-benefit analyses were performed for every aspect of gladiator care and training. The records show calculations determining the optimal nutrition levels to maintain fighting ability while minimizing food costs. They include studies of which medical treatments were cost-effective versus which gladiators should be allowed to die and be replaced. They even contain analyses of the entertainment value of different types of deaths and how this affected ticket sales. The schools operated sophisticated inventory management systems that tracked gladiator assets with the same precision used for any other valuable commodity. Daily reports monitored each gladiator's physical condition, training progress, and estimated remaining lifespan. Weekly summaries provided management with updated profit projections and recommendations for which gladiators should be scheduled for upcoming fights. Regional specialization developed as different schools focused on producing gladiators optimized for specific market segments. The Capua school became known for premium fighters who commanded the highest fees. Schools in Gaul specialized in producing large quantities of lower-quality gladiators for provincial games. Egyptian schools focused on exotic fighters trained in unusual combat styles that appealed to novelty-seeking Roman audiences. The financial success of the gladiator industry attracted investment from the highest levels of Roman society. Senators, generals, and even emperors owned shares in gladiator schools. The industry became so politically influential that it could lobby for favorable legislation and government contracts. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius was forced to impose price controls on gladiator fees because the schools had formed cartels that were driving up costs for public games. Export markets developed as the gladiator schools began selling their products throughout the empire and beyond. Roman gladiators were exported to fight in arenas from Britain to Egypt, commanding premium prices as exotic entertainment. Some schools established franchise operations in other cities, providing training and management expertise in exchange for profit-sharing agreements. The accounting records also reveal the extensive corruption that permeated the gladiator industry. Bribes were paid to officials who arranged favorable scheduling. Judges were bought to ensure predetermined fight outcomes. Military commanders were compensated for providing steady supplies of prisoners for the slave markets. The gladiator schools had corrupted every level of Roman society with their blood money. Perhaps most chilling are the research and development budgets that schools maintained for developing new forms of entertainment and more efficient killing methods. They funded experiments in psychology, medicine, and combat techniques, with the goal of creating more profitable spectacles. They invested in engineering projects to design better arena equipment and more dramatic death traps. They treated human suffering as a technical challenge to be solved through systematic innovation. Modern economists who have studied the Gladiator school financial records describe them as representing one of history's most successful examples of monetizing human misery. The schools had created vertically integrated businesses that controlled every aspect of their product from birth to death, generating profits at every stage of the process, while externalizing all moral and social costs onto their victims and society at large. The rebellion that shook an empire. In 73, before the Common Era, the carefully controlled world of the gladiator schools exploded in the most famous slave rebellion in human history. But what began in the underground cells of the Capua Gladiator School as a desperate escape attempt would grow into a full-scale war that threatened the very foundations of the Roman Empire and revealed the depths of rage that centuries of systematic brutality had created. The rebellion didn't emerge spontaneously from a moment of opportunity. It was the result of months of careful planning by men who had been systematically dehumanized, but had somehow retained enough of their humanity to refuse to accept their fate. The gladiators had developed an intricate communication system using scars on their bodies as a code, allowing them to coordinate resistance activities under the noses of their captors. The leader who emerged from this underground network was a Thracian warrior named Spartacus, a man whose background remains shrouded in mystery, but whose actions would echo through history. Unlike the Hollywood portrayals that would later romanticize his story, the real Spartacus was a product of the gladiator school system, a man who had been broken and rebuilt as a killer, but who had somehow retained the capacity for strategic thinking and leadership that his training was designed to destroy. The planning for the rebellion began during the most brutal training sessions, when guards were distracted by the violence and couldn't monitor conversations between gladiators. Using their coded scar language, the conspirators shared information about guard schedules, weapon locations, and potential escape routes. They identified which gladiators could be trusted and which might betray them to gain favor with their masters. The signal for the rebellion was given during a training session where gladiators were being forced to fight each other with real weapons as punishment for various infractions. Instead of following their orders, Spartacus and 78 other gladiators turned their weapons on their trainers and guards. But their first target wasn't their immediate captors. It was the training equipment itself. The rebels systematically destroyed every wooden sword, every piece of practice armor, every training device that had been used to torment them. They smashed the posts where gladiators had been chained during punishment. They burned the platforms where sexual assaults had been committed. They obliterated every physical reminder of their systematic dehumanization before turning their fury on the human agents of their oppression. The school's owner, Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Batiatus, was found 3 days later crucified with his own training equipment, his body bearing the marks of every torture device he had used on others. His death wasn't quick. The gladiators had used their intimate knowledge of human anatomy to ensure he experienced maximum suffering before dying. They had turned the techniques they had been forced to learn on animals and fellow gladiators against the man who had profited from their misery. But the gladiators didn't stop with killing their immediate oppressors. They methodically hunted down everyone who had participated in their torment: trainers, guards, medical staff, administrators, and visitors who had paid to watch their suffering. They tracked down the wealthy Romans who had purchased sexual access to gladiators and subjected them to the same humiliations they had inflicted. They found the merchants who had sold the school supplies and equipment and made them pay in blood for their complicity. The psychological impact of the rebellion on the surviving gladiators was profound. Men who had been conditioned to view themselves as subhuman property suddenly found themselves capable of independent action and moral choice. The process of breaking free from their psychological conditioning was often as traumatic as the original conditioning itself, as gladiators had to confront the reality of what they had become and what they had been forced to do. Some gladiators couldn't handle the psychological transition and committed suicide rather than face life as free men. Others became catatonic, overwhelmed by the sudden responsibility of making their own decisions after years of having every aspect of their existence controlled by others. Still others channeled their trauma into an unstoppable rage that made them incredibly effective warriors in the rebellion that followed. As word of the rebellion spread, it triggered uprisings at gladiator schools throughout the empire. The systematic brutality that had been used to control the gladiators had created a vast reservoir of suppressed rage that exploded once the rebels proved that resistance was possible. Within weeks, thousands of former gladiators had joined the rebellion, along with regular slaves and even some free Romans who had been horrified by what they had witnessed. The Roman response to the rebellion revealed how dependent the empire had become on institutionalized violence and how threatened the ruling class felt when their victims fought back. The initial attempts to suppress the rebellion were led by local magistrates who grossly underestimated both the military capabilities of the rebels and the depth of their motivation. These early Roman forces were not just defeated, they were annihilated with a thoroughness that shocked the Roman public. The gladiators' military success wasn't accidental. Their training had made them experts in individual combat, but more importantly, their shared trauma had forged them into a unit with extraordinary cohesion and determination. They fought with the knowledge that capture meant not just death, but a return to the systematic torture they had escaped. This gave them a motivation that no Roman army could match. As the rebellion grew, it began to attract supporters from across the social spectrum. Slaves saw it as their chance for freedom. Poor citizens saw it as an opportunity to overthrow an oppressive system. Even some wealthy Romans began to question whether a society built on such systematic cruelty could be worth defending. The rebellion was becoming more than just an escape attempt. It was evolving into a challenge to the moral foundations of Roman civilization. The gladiators proved remarkably effective at psychological warfare, using their intimate knowledge of Roman fears and prejudices against their former masters. They would leave crucified Romans arranged in deliberate patterns that referenced gladiator training techniques. They would stage mock gladiator games where captured Romans were forced to fight each other for the entertainment of former slaves. They transformed the symbols of their oppression into weapons of liberation. Perhaps most terrifying to the Romans was the rebels' systematic destruction of gladiator schools throughout the territories they controlled. The gladiators didn't just free their fellow fighters. They burned the schools to the ground and salted the earth so nothing would ever grow there again. They were attempting to erase not just the physical structures of their oppression, but the very memory of the institutions that had created them. The rebellion lasted for over 2 years, and at its height controlled most of southern Italy. The Roman army eventually defeated the rebels through overwhelming numerical superiority and by cutting off their supply lines, but the victory came at an enormous cost. Thousands of Roman soldiers died fighting men who had been trained to kill with scientific precision and who fought with the fury of those who had nothing left to lose. When the rebellion was finally crushed, the Roman response was swift and merciless. 6,000 captured rebels were crucified along the road between Capua and Rome, their bodies left to rot as a warning to future generations. But even in death, the gladiators had achieved a kind of victory. They had proven that the human spirit could not be completely destroyed, even by the most systematic brutality imaginable. The scientific legacy of systematic cruelty. The techniques developed in Roman gladiator schools for breaking human beings and transforming them into controllable killers did not disappear with the fall of the empire. Instead, they became part of humanity's dark knowledge base, surfacing repeatedly throughout history whenever authoritarian regimes sought to create compliant populations or transform ordinary people into instruments of violence. Modern military psychologists studying historical accounts of gladiator training have identified methodologies that were later used in Nazi concentration camps, Soviet gulags, Chinese re-education centers, and CIA black sites. The Romans had discovered fundamental principles of human psychology that could be exploited to override natural moral restraints and social bonds, creating individuals who would commit atrocities on command. The process of systematic dehumanization, pioneered in gladiator schools, became a template for genocide and ethnic cleansing throughout history. The techniques of identity destruction, social isolation, and gradual moral corruption that transformed slaves into gladiators were refined and employed by totalitarian movements seeking to eliminate specific populations or political opponents. Psychological research conducted in the 20th century confirmed many of the insights that Roman gladiator trainers had discovered through empirical experimentation on their victims. Studies of prisoners of war, concentration camp survivors, and cult members revealed that the human psyche could be systematically dismantled and rebuilt using methods remarkably similar to those documented in gladiator school records. The medical experiments conducted on gladiators anticipated many of the horrors perpetrated by Nazi doctors and other researchers who abandoned ethical constraints in pursuit of knowledge. The gladiator school physicians had established the precedent that human subjects could be used for any purpose if they were first defined as less than human, a rationalization that would be employed repeatedly by later regimes. Perhaps most disturbing is the evidence that the entertainment aspects of gladiator schools also influenced subsequent historical atrocities. The Roman practice of turning human suffering into public spectacle created cultural precedents for the mass rallies public executions, and propaganda films that characterized later totalitarian movements. The Gladiator games had established that ordinary people could be conditioned to enjoy watching other human beings suffer and die. The economic model developed by gladiator schools, treating human beings as commodities to be bought, sold, and consumed for profit, became the foundation for the Atlantic slave trade and other systems of human trafficking. The accounting methods, insurance practices, and inventory management techniques pioneered by Roman slave dealers were adopted and refined by later generations of human traffickers. Modern experts in trauma psychology have identified what they call gladiator syndrome in survivors of systematic abuse who exhibit specific patterns of psychological damage consistent with the conditioning described in Roman sources. These individuals display an inability to form normal relationships, a compulsive need for conflict and violence, and a dissociative relationship with their own bodies that matches historical descriptions of gladiator behavior. The architectural principles embodied in gladiator school design, the use of physical space to control behavior and break down psychological resistance, influenced the construction of prisons, mental hospitals, and other institutional facilities throughout subsequent history. The spatial arrangements that maximized psychological pressure on gladiators became standard features of buildings designed to control and modify human behavior. Perhaps most chilling is the realization that the gladiator schools represented just one example of institutionalized cruelty within Roman society. The methods they developed were also used in other contexts: military training, slave management, criminal punishment, and political control. The entire Roman Empire functioned as a vast laboratory for experimenting with different approaches to dominating and exploiting human beings. The documentation preserved from gladiator schools provides modern researchers with an unparalleled window into the systematic study of human degradation. These records represent one of the earliest examples of what would now be called applied psychology, behavioral modification, and social engineering. The Romans had created a science of cruelty that would inform authoritarian practices for millennia to come. Contemporary studies of radicalization, cult recruitment, and terrorist training have identified recruitment and conditioning methods that closely parallel those used in gladiator schools. The process of breaking down individual identity, replacing natural social bonds with loyalty to the group, and gradually escalating participation in violence follows patterns that the Romans had perfected nearly 2,000 years ago. The global nature of the Roman Empire meant that gladiator school techniques spread to every corner of the known world, influencing local practices and creating hybrid systems that combined Roman methods with indigenous traditions of violence and control. This cultural contamination ensured that the knowledge of how to systematically destroy human dignity would survive the collapse of Rome itself. Modern human rights organizations studying contemporary forms of slavery, human trafficking, and systematic abuse report finding methods and techniques that can be traced directly back to practices documented in Roman gladiator schools. The fundamental approaches to breaking human will and reshaping human behavior remain remarkably consistent across cultures and historical periods. The most sobering realization is that the knowledge developed in gladiator schools represents a form of dark wisdom that can never be completely eliminated from human consciousness. Once discovered, the techniques for systematically destroying human dignity and moral agency become part of our species' permanent knowledge base, available to be rediscovered and applied by any group with sufficient power and moral bankruptcy. The ultimate truth. What the gladiator schools reveal about humanity. As our journey into the darkness of the gladiator schools reaches its conclusion, we are confronted with truths about human nature that are almost too terrible to accept. The Roman gladiator schools weren't aberrations or exceptions. They were the logical extension of a civilization that had convinced itself that some human beings were inherently less valuable than others. The most chilling aspect of the gladiator school system wasn't the cruelty itself, but how completely normal it became. Wealthy Romans discussed their favorite gladiators over dinner with the same casual interest they might show in racehorses or hunting dogs. Children were brought to watch training sessions as educational entertainment. Senators passed legislation regulating the gladiator trade with the same bureaucratic efficiency they brought to managing grain imports. The Romans didn't create these institutions despite being civilized. They created them because they believed they were civilized. Their sophisticated legal system, their architectural achievements, their philosophical traditions, and their military prowess convinced them that their cultural superiority justified any treatment of those they conquered or enslaved. The gladiator schools represented the logical endpoint of a worldview that divided humanity into those who deserved dignity and those who existed solely for the benefit of others. Perhaps most disturbing is the realization that the psychological and social conditions that enabled the gladiator schools continue to exist in various forms throughout the modern world. The capacity for systematic dehumanization, the willingness to profit from human suffering, and the ability to rationalize atrocities through appeals to higher purposes remain constant features of human societies. The gladiator schools succeeded not because the Romans were uniquely evil, but because they had created social structures that encouraged and rewarded cruelty, while protecting those who participated in it from moral accountability. The diffusion of responsibility across multiple institutions, schools, government, law, religion, entertainment, allowed individuals to participate in systematic horror while maintaining the illusion that they were merely playing small, necessary roles in a larger system. The audiences who cheered in the Colosseum weren't monsters. They were ordinary people who had been conditioned to view certain forms of violence as acceptable entertainment. The guards and trainers who brutalized gladiators weren't sadists. They were employees doing jobs that their society had defined as normal and necessary. The physicians who tortured patients weren't evil. They were professionals working within a system that had redefined healing as control and medicine as manipulation. This normalization of systematic cruelty represents perhaps the most important lesson the gladiator schools can teach us. Evil doesn't require monsters. It only requires ordinary people who are willing to participate in systems that dehumanize others, whether through active participation, passive acceptance, or willful ignorance of what is being done in their name. The gladiator schools also reveal how quickly and completely human beings can be transformed when subjected to systematic pressure. The men and women who entered those institutions as slaves, criminals, or prisoners of war were not fundamentally different from anyone else. They had families, hopes, fears, and moral beliefs. Yet within months or years, most had been transformed into creatures who could kill without hesitation and die without apparent resistance. This transformation wasn't achieved through mystical or supernatural means. It was accomplished through the systematic application of psychological pressure, social isolation, physical conditioning, and chemical manipulation. The Romans had developed a technology of human transformation that was remarkably effective and terrifyingly reproducible. They had proven that human nature itself could be reshaped through sufficient application of force and manipulation. The economic dimension of the gladiator schools reveals another disturbing truth about human societies: their capacity to create profitable enterprises based entirely on human suffering. The gladiator industry wasn't a side effect of Roman civilization, but one of its most successful business sectors. It generated enormous wealth, employed thousands of people, and became so economically important that the empire's stability depended on its continued operation. This economic dependence on systematic cruelty created powerful incentives to rationalize and justify practices that violated every principle of human dignity. Entire professions developed around maximizing the profit potential of human misery. Legal systems evolved to protect the property rights of those who owned human beings while denying any rights to the owned themselves. Cultural institutions created narratives that portrayed systematic exploitation as natural, necessary, or even beneficial for those being exploited. The religious dimensions of the gladiator schools reveal how spiritual beliefs can be perverted to justify material atrocities. The Romans convinced themselves that gladiator combat honored the gods, that death in the arena was a form of religious sacrifice, and that the suffering of slaves served divine purposes. They created elaborate theological justifications for practices that violated every principle of compassion and mercy that their own philosophers had articulated. This religious dimension is particularly important because it demonstrates how even humanity's highest aspirations, our spiritual beliefs and moral philosophies, can be corrupted and turned into instruments of oppression. The gladiator schools didn't operate despite Roman religious and ethical traditions, but because those traditions had been systematically distorted to serve the interests of those who profited from human suffering. The technological innovations developed in gladiator schools, from architecture designed to control behavior to medical techniques for prolonging suffering to psychological methods for breaking human resistance, represent a form of knowledge that, once discovered, can never be completely forgotten. These techniques become part of humanity's permanent toolkit, available to be rediscovered and refined by each generation of those who seek power over others. This persistence of dangerous knowledge explains why the lessons of the gladiator schools remain relevant to contemporary discussions about human rights, technological ethics, and social justice. The specific forms of cruelty practiced by the Romans may have disappeared, but the underlying capacity for systematic dehumanization continues to manifest in new contexts with new technologies and new justifications. The international scope of the gladiator system, with schools operating throughout the Roman Empire and gladiators being traded across vast distances, reveals how systematic cruelty can become a globalizing force that spreads its methods and values across diverse cultures and societies. The gladiator schools didn't just brutalize their immediate victims, but corrupted entire societies by normalizing violence, commodifying human life, and creating economic incentives for systematic exploitation. Perhaps most troubling is the realization that the gladiator schools were not imposed on Roman society by external conquerors or radical revolutionaries. They were created by Romans themselves as expressions of their own values and priorities. They represented not a deviation from Roman civilization, but one of its logical culminations, the fulfillment of beliefs about human hierarchy, military virtue, and entertainment that were central to Roman culture. This internal origin of systematic cruelty serves as a warning about the capacity of any human society to generate its own forms of institutionalized evil. The Romans weren't uniquely susceptible to moral corruption. They were human beings like ourselves, operating with cognitive and emotional capacities that we share. The social, economic, and psychological forces that enabled the gladiator schools continue to exist in various forms throughout the modern world. The legacy of the gladiator schools extends far beyond their immediate historical impact to encompass fundamental questions about human nature, social organization, and moral responsibility that remain as relevant today as they were 2,000 years ago. They force us to confront uncomfortable truths about our species' capacity for both systematic cruelty and systematic complicity in the suffering of others. The ultimate lesson of the gladiator schools may be that the protection of human dignity requires not just good intentions or moral principles, but constant vigilance against the social, economic, and psychological forces that encourage dehumanization. The Romans weren't evil because they lacked moral knowledge. Their philosophers had articulated principles of human dignity and compassion that would be familiar to any modern reader. They became evil because they allowed other considerations: profit, entertainment, national prestige, cultural superiority, to override their moral knowledge when it became inconvenient or costly to maintain. The gladiator schools succeeded because they created structures that made cruelty profitable, normal, and psychologically comfortable for those who participated in or benefited from the system. They demonstrated that human beings are capable of committing atrocities, not just in moments of passion or desperation, but as part of organized, rational, long-term enterprises that become integrated into the fabric of society itself. As we reflect on these dark chapters of human history, we must ask ourselves what structures in our own societies might be serving similar functions. What institutions are we supporting or tolerating that systematically dehumanize certain groups of people? What economic incentives are we creating that reward cruelty and exploitation? What forms of entertainment are we consuming that depend on human suffering? What social hierarchies are we maintaining that make some people's pain invisible or acceptable to us? The gladiator schools stand as perhaps history's most perfect example of what happens when a society decides that the suffering of some human beings is an acceptable price for the pleasure and profit of others. They remind us that civilization is not a protection against barbarism, but a tool that can be used to make barbarism more efficient, more profitable, and more psychologically comfortable for those who benefit from it. The men, women, and children who died in the gladiator schools of Rome were not anonymous statistics or abstract victims. They were human beings with individual stories, personalities, dreams, and relationships that were systematically destroyed for the entertainment of crowds who had forgotten their own humanity in the process of denying the humanity of others. Their suffering echoes across the centuries not as ancient history, but as a warning about capacities that remain present within our own species and our own societies. The gladiator schools are gone, but the human capacity for creating new forms of systematic cruelty continues to manifest in every generation and every culture that loses sight of the fundamental dignity and worth of every human being. In remembering their stories, we honor not just their memory, but our own obligation to ensure that such systematic dehumanization never again becomes normalized, profitable, or acceptable in any human society. The price of human dignity is not just eternal vigilance, but eternal action to resist the forces that would reduce any human being to nothing more than entertainment, profit, or power for others. The darkness we have explored tonight serves as both warning and challenge. Warning of what we are capable of becoming when we allow expedience to override ethics, profit to trump compassion, and entertainment to justify exploitation. Challenge to build societies and institutions that protect human dignity, not just when it is convenient or profitable to do so, but especially when protecting it requires sacrifice, courage, and the willingness to resist popular demands for the commodification of human suffering. The gladiator schools of Rome stand as monuments to humanity's capacity for evil, but they also bear witness to the indestructible human spirit that, even under the most systematic brutality, retained the capacity to resist, to rebel, and to remind us that no system of oppression, no matter how sophisticated or profitable, can completely destroy the human soul's recognition of its own infinite worth and dignity. In the end, the gladiator schools failed not because they were militarily defeated or economically unsustainable, but because they violated truths about human nature and human worth that no amount of force, conditioning, or rationalization can permanently suppress. The rebellion of Spartacus was not just a military uprising, but a reassertion of fundamental human values that the gladiator system had tried to destroy. Even in defeat, the rebels had proven that the human spirit remains unconquerable, that dignity cannot be permanently destroyed, and that the recognition of our shared humanity will always eventually triumph over systems built on its denial. As we conclude this journey into darkness, let us carry with us not just the horror of what human beings are capable of inflicting on each other, but also the inspiration of those who, even in the deepest darkness, found the courage to resist, to remember their humanity, and to fight for the recognition that every human being possesses a dignity that no force on earth has the right to destroy. The gladiator schools are dust. Their owners are dead. Their crowds are forgotten. But the human values they tried to destroy, compassion, dignity, solidarity, and love, remain alive in every person who chooses to recognize the humanity of others. and to resist the forces that would reduce any human being to mere entertainment, property, or profit. In that choice, made new by each generation and each individual, lies our hope for a future where the darkness we have witnessed tonight remains forever in the past, remembered but never repeated, studied but never celebrated, understood but never normalized. The ultimate victory over the gladiator schools lies not in forgetting their existence, but in ensuring that their like never rises again from the ashes of human moral failure, and the surrender of our most fundamental values to the demands of expedience, entertainment, and economic gain.